Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast. Boy, do I have a great show for you today, because I've recently discovered a company called Ateliere, which is a one-of-a-kind tech company that solves a lot of production and distribution challenges presented by technology, all through a cloud-native digital media supply chain and distributed platform. And the reason it's an exciting one is because they work with leading production and streaming companies and aims to have the leading and only solution available on the market for the expected $932 billion streaming industry by 2028. Now, that on its own would be pretty cool. But he also has an inspiring backstory, and I don't want to reveal too much because Dan will talk about that in a few moments. But let me tell you, it's an absolute cracker. So today I want to learn more about that backstory and how the company is fueling an evolution with helping streaming giants consolidate all that media content and also helping other platforms come together with merging businesses. Not to mention the next generation of filmmakers and directors and how they need to be thinking cloud first and upskilling the entertainment industry to incorporate new technology. So if you love film, TV, entertainment and technology, you should love this one. So buckle up and hold on tight as I beam your ears all the way to Beverly Hills, where Dan Goman is waiting to speak with us today. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Sure. Thank you so much. So I'm the founder of Ateliere, which is a SaaS-based content supply chain platform used by many of the world's leading M&E enterprises.
And before we go any further into that, I've read that you've got an incredibly inspiring backstory of growing up in an oppressive communist regime, learning English from watching television shows and being taught programming from an old IBM computer. So I've got to ask, can you share your origin story and the path that got you here?
I was born in Western Romania during a time when it was under communist rule, and we fled the country in 1984. So, it was a kind of an interesting story where, my parents were professors at the university. Intellectuals were, targeted by the communist regime in a big way because, they, of course, were responsible for indoctrinating, the next generations, if you will. So it was very important for them to have a very strong hold and a very strong commitment from the intellectuals that were teaching the younger generation. So my parents' philosophy, way of thinking didn't really align with that, and because of that, they were sidelined, persecuted, interrogated, all the above. So at some point in 1984, we finally were able to flee the country, and we landed in Los Angeles. So you can imagine that was a bit of a shock at that time. The country, Romania, was one of the poorest and most isolated countries in the world. Everything was controlled. And going from that to LA and, seeing this brand new world was, a shock to the system, if you will. None of us spoke any English. And a lot of the learning that we did in terms of the English language came from an old black and white TV that most of the time, quite honestly, wasn't even working. So that was a difficult transitional period. And then in terms of how I actually got into technology, I always had a passion for technology, just, seeing all these new gadgets, all these new things. I think, when we first came to the States, I saw several, people with these massive cell phones. At the time, cell phones were, very early on and primarily would be used in cars. They came along with a big box, that you'd lug around with you. But I thought that was fascinating. And I've managed to convince my father to buy me an old IBM PC Junior where I spent hours and hours and hours teaching myself basic programming. Most of them, quite honestly, would end up crashing. And it took me a while to learn to save them to floppy disks before they crashed and before I lost everything. But that's essentially the backstory and how I got into technology. And then, of course, my career progressed into more of a traditional software development path.
Wow, what an amazing story. And to think you went from those black and white TVs, IBM PCs, floppy disks, to talking to me today in Beverly Hills. So it's certainly got a happy ending. But of course, that path would lead you to Ateliere. So can you tell me a little bit more about how you're fueling an evolution by helping streaming giants consolidate its media content and ultimately helping other platforms come together with merging businesses? Because it's incredibly cool what you're doing here, isn't it?
Well, I certainly find it very exciting because we're right in the middle of this, massive transition that's going on and has started a number of years ago, but in the way that we consume content and the way content is offered. And our story as a company is super interesting. I founded the company in early 2010. And the idea at that time was for us to aggregate streaming video on demand channels. A lot of what you're seeing right now with Amazon channels, Apple channels, Roku channels, etc. All of that is kind of what I envisioned in early 2010. I thought there would be a transition from broadcast to digital. And then in a digital market like that, I also thought that there would be an explosion of streaming video channels, which of course I was right. At the time, when we were trying to build the business, the technology to power all of this wasn't really quite there. A lot of what we take for granted today, apps, streaming anywhere, the quality of streaming, etc., was in development. So we ended up building our own technology platform really to power our own business at the time. Eventually, our content partners started asking, how did you do that so quickly? How were you able to get the content from here to there so quickly? So that then, of course, started, the classical startup pivot where we realized that continuing down the path of building a content business was going to be, super expensive. And we saw just how expensive content can be with companies like Quibi that were able to raise a significant amount of money. And very quickly, they realized that, maybe it's not going to work. So even with all that money and a huge war chest like that, they weren't quite able to find their niche and they shut down. So we didn't have anywhere near close to the amount of money that and on a personal level, just having the background in technology and seeing that there was interest in the platforms that we had built, we decided to go in a different direction. And when I talk to our customers, I often say that we decided to go and provide the shovels versus digging for gold. So fast forward to where we are today, where streaming is a norm and there's such a huge demand for new content. What we've seen, especially in the last couple of years, is that the traditional infrastructure-based supply chain simply just can't keep up with the demand. The production that's going on and continues to go on, and the demand, for new content all the time. We've also seen and continue to see an acceleration of mergers in M&E. And it's driven by this continued demand for video content, and especially on these new streaming platforms. So in any merger, what we're seeing is that there are unique challenges for media companies, especially around some things that you probably as an outsider wouldn't even think would be a problem. But the number one problem we see on behalf of our customers is that they're having a hard time when they're coming together, determining what content's available. What does the company have available at its disposal for licensing, and which languages, what regions, so rights determination and compliance editing. The second thing that we see is that, there's the handling and being able to handle the need for distribution of the available content to new available platforms without disrupting the existing systems, which took a long time to put in place. That's a very difficult proposition. So with our platform, and the reason why we've been getting so much traction as of late, especially, is that our platforms helps businesses post-merger. And we essentially layer on top of existing systems, bespoke systems that have been in place for a long time. We connect it all. And then we ensure that there's one view of all the content that's available, between all these newly formed companies, newly merged companies. And we call this the content hub. So regardless of the location or the format of the media for the content, you can view it all in one platform. So rather than spending the time to determine how to integrate these disparate systems and go the traditional route of, well, we've now bought this company, let's figure out how to tie these systems together. And most of these large companies simply come to us. We're a cloud-based platform. We hook into all existing systems, and we provide one view, one content hub of all the content across all the different companies and business units, of course, within these larger entities that have now merged. So we solve a lot of problems, and we're enabling the consolidation of these large media companies to happen quicker and easier. And, there's significant savings associated with that as well.
And on this podcast, we've talked a lot about technical debt and the problems with legacy technology, particularly in the aviation industry, where so much of the new tech is built on technology from way back in the 60s. And I suspect it's very similar in the entertainment industry too. So can I ask that we take a look behind the curtain and tell me a little bit more about how your technology solves a lot of the production and distribution challenges presented by legacy technology?
Well, that's a good point. I'm kind of an outsider. I've been working in this space for, a number of years, but I still, don't have the experience that, a lot of my colleagues in the industry have had. I'm more of a traditional software guy. I came in from the outside. And of course, with the perception, like many of us that are not part of the industry, that's built from, the movies that we watch. So, as an outsider kind of looking in and, having this perception of this high tech, whiz bang world where you just click a couple of buttons and all of a sudden things happen. I mean, essentially was my perception of, the production world, the media and entertainment world. And that couldn't be farther from the truth. On the front end, of course, we get to see when we look at all these great movies that are being released all the time, we get to see, CGI, we get to see all kinds of visual effects, and it fuels this perception that everything is so high tech. On the back end, for many years, and I think even today, it continues to be where, a lot of the stuff that we see is done manually. There's, autonomous systems that, are separate, siloed. It's in some respects a very serial process instead of a collaborative, parallel process where you can get things done quicker, faster. And it relies on old systems, old machinery, by and large, to do all the things that are required as part of the production workflow. So we've taken a bit of a different approach. Our platform has been built from the ground up in the cloud, primarily because that's where we were operating at that time. The cloud just made a lot of sense to start the development on. So we consider ourselves, and I think by all accounts, we're the first truly cloud native media supply chain platform. So what this means for our customers is that they're able to take advantage of all the benefits of the cloud, such as being able to scale on demand and, quote unquote, right size for the project. When we were building the platform, our focus was specifically on enabling cloud native media supply chains for distribution at that time. So we looked at the roadblocks that could prevent this from occurring. And of course, one of the biggest roadblocks in our industry, primarily because of the type of content and the size of these files that we're talking about video and not Word docs or PDFs. So video files are massive. And so when you're proposing to move video files from an on-prem storage solution to the cloud, all of a sudden that becomes a massive roadblock. I mean, there's costs, there's logistics, and then interestingly enough, over time, in a lot of these content libraries, you see a significant amount of duplication because of various licensing arrangements, which required specific and sometimes very small edits from the original. There's just version after version after version. So, of course, when you're talking about video files and moving all that in media into the cloud, it's very costly. And so we developed a unique technology which examines the video content frame by frame and identifies duplication and is automatically able to remove that duplication during the process or before you're proposing and you're working on transferring the content into the cloud. And of course, the savings is significant. I think we're seeing savings upwards of 70% in terms of both storage space and cost in the cloud. So that is a significant amount of money when you're talking about video content. In addition to that, we also wanted to stay away from the complexity of configuring and onboarding that is generally the highlight of legacy systems of record for managing media. So legacy systems, and this is really not unique to the media and entertainment world, but in a general enterprise sense, every large enterprise system, when you're talking about deploying it, it's always some sort of a multi-year, multi-million-dollar endeavor. We've taken a bit of a different approach where we've designed the entire system to be implemented in weeks, in a very short amount of time, with little to no coding needed. There's no scripting requirement. It's all just configuration. And it's designed to show ROI very quickly. And that is something that's, I think, unique to the platform and is super appreciated by our customers. And as we look forward, we're rapidly expanding the platform to power more and more of the content workflow. Eventually, our vision is, of course, to power the entire content workflow from camera all the way out to the consumer. So I know that's a lot of information and probably a lot of technical jargon. Hopefully that wasn't too confusing, but essentially, I guess to sum it up, what we're doing is we're taking the industry from heavily manual, on-prem, legacy, big iron, if you will, and transitioning everything into the cloud, all the workflows in the cloud, and unlocking the magic of collaboration in the process. So I hope that makes sense.
It really does. And you're in a safe space here with technical jargon. You came to the right place. And before you came on the podcast, I was also doing a bit of research on you guys. And I was reading about why the next generation of filmmakers and directors need to start thinking cloud first and upskilling the entertainment industry to incorporate this new technology. Is that something you can expand on too?
Yeah, absolutely. So even though, our industry is unique in many different ways, what's not unique is that there is still a product, and that product still needs to get out to the market quickly. So, the concept of, time to market, reduction in cost, enhancement of quality, so cheaper, faster, better, still applies, to content as well. It doesn't matter that we're talking about content production. All this is still important. So when we look at the landscape, when we look at, the demand for new content and new streaming services popping up literally every day across the globe, it just creates an imperative on the industry to be able to do all of this in a different way that's a lot more effective, a lot more streamlined. So I was talking to an iconic studio here in Hollywood, and the distribution team was telling me how difficult it is for them to be able to keep up with the demand. The studio itself is, of course, producing content for itself, and especially in the last couple of years, and on a continuing basis, they're producing content on behalf of platforms like Apple, Netflix, Amazon, et cetera. So they're producing more content than ever. They still have the same number of staff. They're not really able to get the budget to, increase the staff, but they need to keep up with this new increased demand. So they're essentially left with no choice but to look for alternatives that allow them to be a lot more streamlined, a lot more efficient, and to do things cheaper, faster, better. And if you think about it, really, filmmaking is a collaborative process and happens on a global scale. And that's the other aspect of all this. Today's movies may be filmed in Australia or New Zealand. The visual effects may be happening in Canada. And of course, post-production, could happen in Hollywood. And the only way for this to happen in a truly real-time collaborative way is by connecting everyone and sharing the content in the cloud. I think, these are some critical reasons why it's important for filmmakers and directors and all the people responsible for the productions to focus on, shifting to the cloud and upskill the entertainment industry to incorporate this new technology.
And also, there's so much we can talk about here, but just to bring to life everything that we've talked about so far, do you have any, client stories or use cases that you are able to share? You don't have to name any names, but just to bring everything to life.
Sure. Within the last 2.5 or 2 years or so, we've been working with one of Hollywood's most, I know I just said that, but here's another most iconic studio in Hollywood that, when they came to us, they didn't really have a supply chain. Their supply chain consisted of a bunch of outsourced vendors that would receive orders, and then they would do stuff on behalf of the content studio. Now, the process was super inefficient. It was very costly. I'm not even going to tell you how much it cost, but it was just an insane amount of money of operating that on a yearly basis. Super inefficient. They had a team of people that would do nothing all day but sit on the phone for about 8 hours. maybe even longer, with these various different vendors to try to figure out, where things were at in the process. And of course, everything was spreadsheet driven. They came to us and we helped them build an entire supply chain in the cloud. And now our platform is essentially their content hub, housing more than 4,000 movies and about 17,000 episodic titles. And everything is push button. Everything is automated. When they want to find a particular title or a piece of content, all they do is punch that into the system and it comes up right away. When they want to deliver that piece of content because of a licensing deal, it's 3 or 4 clicks and it's out the door. So you're going from months potentially and doing all these tasks to in some cases minutes, hours, or days. The difference, both in terms of efficiency and cost, is pretty dramatic.
And I also read that we can expect to see an incredible $932 billion streaming industry by 2028. I mean, what excites you about this future, where we're heading, and the role that you guys are going to play in that too?
Well, it is super exciting if you look at it. I mean, arguably, one can say that streaming is one of the fastest growing consumer trends in modern history. I mean, it really just started. It seems like it's always been here now, because now we're so used to it, being able to take out our phones and just have our entire entertainment library on the go with us. But a few short years ago, it didn't exist, and so you had, the early entrants that, led the industry, and you had the various different models being offered on a commercial basis. Then now we're seeing, of course, new models introduced. So we started with the SVOD, and now we're seeing AVOD, and all this continued growth in streaming means that the industry needs technology that can operate at the pace of business. So in our industry, quite honestly, technology really does make or break the business. And we've worked with a lot of customers that have had, some horror stories, including ourselves. When we first started out, we were trying to build the streaming business. Now, granted, that was a number of years ago. All of our technology was essentially out. And I can't tell you how many technology failures we had, which of course held the business back and didn't really help us progress at all. So as I was saying earlier, there really isn't time for some sort of a multi-year, multi-million-dollar development and deployment of technology. The technology needs to be here now, and it needs to enable the business to move as quickly as it needs to move. And I'm just excited for us to be in a position to power the growth of the industry and to enable the business to grow on a global basis. And that's essentially what we're doing as we're working with some of the largest players in media and entertainment industry.
Wow, how cool is that? And what about just trends? I mean, you must be monitoring many trends in the industry. Is there anything there that particularly excites you too?
Well, I always have a hard time, focusing on just one, because there's so many great things happening. But, we've talked a lot about the big players in the streaming market, but to me, one area that's overlooked is, and probably one of the most exciting for me, is the trend that anyone can be a content creator, and how that in turn is reshaping or redefining the role and the definition of a broadcaster. So mobile devices have become these, high definition cameras that capture beautiful, high quality images, and they're connected to the internet, which means that anyone can be creating content and collaborating with others in the cloud. And there are millions of these content creators reaching audiences in amazing ways. And, our goal, and especially as of late, we have been focusing a lot on how to enable these, small to medium-sized content creators, and how do we become a part of enabling this entire creative revolution. So to me, it's pretty exciting. Just in terms of the implications for, like I said, broadcasters, what that means, who is a broadcaster these days, and how that's driving, a different type of content consumption and engagement, from viewers.
And as someone who has become a successful startup developer, as an immigrant coming from a somewhat troubling background, I'm curious, are there any lessons that you've learned along the way that has facilitated Atelière's significant success, and anything you'd pass down to anybody listening at the very beginning of their journey?
Yeah, I think probably the most important lesson I learned is, it may sound brutal, but it really is, required. It's adapt or die. And that's something you learn pretty quickly coming from one of the poorest and most isolated countries at the time to the largest and most advanced country in the world. It's kind of a shock, and you either do adapt or you're not doing well. Let's see. So I think this lesson served me well in this journey. We started off with a business idea that was a good business idea many years ago, but we were way too early. And, we had to adapt and, find our own path to success. And the lesson that I learned as I was growing up and, coming from, Romania, transitioning to this, new country, learning, the culture, learning the language, et cetera, I think it served me well. And I would also add that along the way, as I was in the journey of building the company, I think I've worked with a lot of people that I would call purists and absolutists. And, they're stuck on the original idea and there's no way they're going to shift off of that. And, that to me is a recipe for failure. And so, adaptability, being flexible, being pragmatic, understanding what works and doesn't work, I think is super helpful in terms of being successful.
And we began the podcast talking about your origin story and the path that you've been on. And I'm now going to ask you to leave something else for everyone listening. And that is there a book that has inspired you along the way and something we can add to our Amazon wish list for other listeners to check out? Is there anything that springs to mind now?
Yes, I just picked up a book and I haven't finished reading it, to be honest with you. So I just started, but it's super fascinating. The name of the book is called Jellyfish Age Backwards. It's by a Danish biologist. And the title itself is due to, essentially is a tiny jellyfish that's no longer than a fingernail. And it does something pretty amazing. When stressed by hunger or sudden change in water temperature, it can revert back to its young polyp stage and start its life all over again. And, I'm quoting here from the book. It says, with no physiological recollection of ever having been older. And that to me is pretty amazing in so many ways. And the interest in this topic for me stems from the fact that I'm super passionate about health optimization. But, just this particular example of this jellyfish and how it's able to do that, by itself is something that, kind of struck a chord with me, because along the way, when you're building a company, you often have really bad days. You often have stressful days. And in some ways, you kind of have to do what this jellyfish is doing, even though you're not, regenerating yourself or, getting any younger. You do have to just put everything in the past, leave it. And every night you kind of have to leave things, there, and then wake up in the morning refreshed and start it all over again. So to me, from that sense, this book is pretty fascinating. So I can give you an update once I finish it, but I thought it was pretty interesting, and your listeners may find it pretty interesting as well.
Absolutely, and me too. I'll be adding that to the wish list and checking that out for myself. But before I let you go, we've covered so much in a short amount of time today. So for anyone listening, just wanting to dig a little bit deeper, find out a little bit more, check you out online, or even contact your team, what's the best starting point for everything?
I think our website is probably the best place. And if there's any interest in finding out more information, our listeners should go to ateliere.com, and it's spelled ATELIERE.com. So ateliere.com, and there's all kinds of information there in terms of being able to contact us.
Well, thank you so much for coming on today, talking more about this one-of-a-kind tech company that solves a lot of the production and distribution challenges presented by legacy technology through the use of cloud-native digital media, supply chain and distribution platforms. But more than anything, coming on and sharing your story too, and bringing that to life and hopefully inspiring people around the world with that. So thank you once again for joining me today.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate your time.
Wow, what a powerful story there. Yeah, I think for me, it had absolutely everything. It was a movie in itself, wasn't it? But learning more about what goes on behind the curtain around the streaming business, the entertainment industry, and the technology that makes it all possible, and the struggles with the legacy tech problems too. And as I said at the very beginning of the podcast, why the next generation of filmmakers and directors need to think cloud first and upskilling the entertainment industry to incorporate this new technology. But if you work in this industry, I'd love to hear more about your insights, your experience, and we'll keep this conversation going. So email me, techblogwriter@outlook.com, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram @Neil C. Hughes. So keep your questions. If you want to come on the podcast, anything at all, let me know. And today we talked about streaming and the technology behind the world of entertainment. But what are we going to talk about tomorrow? Well, it's time for me to spin the wheel of fortune, which will determine what we discuss. But I'm not going to tell you where it stops. To find out, you're going to have to join me bright and early tomorrow, where I'll be mooching in your podcast feeds with another interview. So just a big thank you for listening as always. And until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.